Well, there's lots of projects piling up on the workbench here and lots of things in progress. But I think the closest thing to completion right now is our little hammerhead. It's been forged, it's been ground, it's just nearly polished other than the fact that we ran it back through the fire to put the touch mark on it. So it is ready to harden and temper. For this today, I think I'm going to go ahead and use the heat treating oven. That allows me to bring this up to temperature in a very controlled manner, get a very precise critical temperature on it, and I can do something else while it does that. So I don't have to stand there and watch it the whole time. Much more efficient for me in the shop, and while this is heating, I'll go on and do something else. So let's head over and set the heat treating oven up and get it ready to go. Now this is a real mess over here. I'm almost embarrassed to even show it on camera. Ultimately, this oven is going to all go over there, and the old oven is going to go on a shelf below this oven. But my welding cart that has my wire feeder on there and the setup for my TIG torch and both of my gas bottles is what the old heat treat oven is sitting on. And I haven't figured out what to do with all that stuff yet. I think I'm going to make a rack that holds the bottles underneath my welding table and make an overhead rack for the wire feeder and all that kind of stuff, but I just haven't had time to do that. So right now this just kind of sits right in the way, but it's functional here and it works, so we're going to go with it. Now I'm going to look up in my William E. Bryson Heat Treatment Selection and Application of Tool Steels. For the small shop, this is kind of the Bible on heat treating information, and it's going to tell me everything I need to know about heat treating 4140. And what I really need to know is I need a pre-soak temperature of 1200 degrees and a high hardening temperature of 1550. So I'll set the heat treat oven up for those. It'll do all of that for me. That's one of the advantages of this oven. I don't have to worry about coming over and changing temperatures. All I have to do is make sure I'm here before it shuts itself off at the end of the cycle. And it even gives me tempering temperatures, and we'll talk about that when we get to the tempering part. So I'm going to put my hammer right in the middle of the oven here. Okay, now we can set this. And it's takes a little bit of getting used to, but if I push enough buttons here, sooner or later we get to the right temperature. I want to set a 1200 degree soak time. I'll enter that, and I'm going to hold that for 20 minutes. That guarantees that it's getting a nice even heat. I'm going to take it up as fast as I can from 1200 to the next temp, which is the high temp or critical temperature. We're going to set that at 1550. And we're going to hold that for 10 minutes just to make sure it really gets there. And before that ends, then I need to get over here and temper this. I'm not going to set a third time, so we're going to go ahead and start this. And that should take care of this. It'll be about an hour and a half, maybe 2 hours for it to run through the entire cycle. And I can go on and I can do something else while this does my heating for me. Okay, our hammerhead is just almost through its cycle. You can see this runs a little over the target temperature, and then it runs a little down to try and average out. Sooner or later it pretty well settles in, but it's got about 1 minute left to go, so it's time to move the camera and get ready. I've used this steel bar to preheat my oil. Oil should be a few hundred degrees for quenching. It is thinner and runnier that way and does a better job of quenching. But we're done with that now, and it's time to quench the hammer. I'm just going to plunge the entire thing in and cool it all off. Keep it moving up and down and around in a figure 8. This is a commercial heat treating oil. It's made for quenching. I don't recommend old motor oil. A lot of people like olive oil. I haven't done much with that, partially because I think it might attract critters. And you should keep it moving and in the quench until it is pretty well cooled off, or at least down to the temperature of the quench. So we're good there. So we've quenched the hammerhead. It is cooled down to the same temperatures of the quench, which is still too hot to touch. But now I'm going to put it in a toaster oven. This is just a nice simple way to temper small parts. It's fairly accurate, not 100% probably, but a few degrees one way or the other doesn't make any difference. I'm going to go to 300 degrees. I got a timer set for an hour, and we're just going to leave it in there. Now here is the chart out of the page that I showed you earlier. You can see where it gives you a preheat temperature, gives you a hardening temperature, tells you to quench it in oil. It has the basic chemistry of the steel, although this can vary a little bit from one manufacturer to the other. And then it has a tempering guide. As quenched, it's 56 Rockwell, so this is not as hard as a higher carbon tool steel. You know, the carbon is only 0.4% or 40 points of carbon. So it's never going to get as hard. But for a hammer, it doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be brittle hard. It needs to be good and durable. So that's just fine. And I'm just going to temper it to the lowest tempering temperature it recommends, which should result in 53 Rockwell. But you can temper it higher if you have different needs. For doing bottom swedges and fullers and things like that, I would probably temper this more into the 450 range. So somewhere between 50 and 52 Rockwell is where I would go for. Because you want a good long-lasting tool, it doesn't need to hold a cutting edge. And again, this is the book I'm using as my reference. It's a very handy book to have in the shop. It has a lot more information than you'll ever use and can really confuse you at the beginning sections reading about some of the theory. But if you can get through that, it's all good stuff to know. We'll let our little ball-peen hammer bake in the oven at 300 degrees for a full hour. So this would be nice served up with a nice salad, maybe a dinner roll. Oh wait, different subject. The next thing to do is going to be a little bit of wax, just because I like a wax finish. And while it's still hot, 300 degrees is just an ideal temperature to put the wax on at. Smokes just a little bit, which means it's cooking into the surface. But it's not burning off, so it's not too hot. And I do this now just because it's hot. And then when I polish it, there will be no wax on the polished surfaces to make the actual hammer faces slippery. So we're going to let this cool now. Just let it air cool. Frequently after tempering, you can quench stuff. In theory, it's probably better, helps prevent any grain growth, but I think in practice, anything benefit gained from doing that is so minimal that I always just let things air cool after I temper them. Usually I do this last thing of the day and put them in the tempering oven. It's got a timer on it. I just walk off and leave it, worry about it tomorrow. But it's midday, so today we're going to worry about it today. Once this cools, don't want to touch it yet, we'll take it back to the grinding room and we will polish the faces. There's no more shaping, no more grinding that needs to be done, just cleaning up and polishing. After hardening and tempering the hammer, putting the wax on it, I let this sit and cool off and went on and did other things and didn't get back to it yesterday. So it's a day later. Doesn't hurt anything. It's already been hardened, tempered, so it's not an issue at all to let it sit as long as you need to. But it is time to go ahead and polish these faces. So let's head back over to the grinder. We're going to go right back to the 400 grit belt, and with any luck, that's all we're going to need to clean up the ends of these faces. Now, if you don't have a belt grinder and you need to go to finer finishes, angle grinders usually don't have flap discs or anything that will go that fine. They usually stop at about 120, or maybe you can find some 220 ones, and that's not a bad finish for a hammer. But for these, I like a more polished finish. And one way you can achieve that is with a woodworking type palm sander, the little oscillating random orbital type palm sanders. Take a 5-inch disc or 4-inch disc, depending on the one you have. And you can usually get those discs up to 320 or 400 grit if you know where to look. You probably can't get that at the home center. You might have to order them online, but they are available in finer grits. And that's a pretty convenient thing to just work over the end of something like this to polish them up. I've seen people use them for some of the final finishing on knife blades to get a smoother finish. So that's not a bad way to go. They're pretty easy to find, pretty affordable, and because it's random orbital, it leaves a very nice finish. Belt sander definitely can leave a pattern that you can tell it was done on a belt sander if you're not careful. But in polishing, I think we will overcome that. So let's head out there and give this a little polish. For this part of the project, I'm going to go ahead and use this slower speed belt grinder. I'm not really worried about overheating the hammerhead. There's a fair amount of mass there, and if I work barehanded while I grind or while I polish, my hands will get hot long before I have altered the temper on the hammerhead. But this helps keep it in control. It goes a little slower, a little smoother, and it should result in a better finish in the long run, just because I won't over grind in one place and end up with some sort of little facet that I didn't want. So this is just a little bit more controlled by virtue of being slower. And again, we'll need all of our safety stuff. Everything but the gloves this time. Cleans that up very nicely. Still looks like it's been sanded though, and it isn't a mirror polish. Now I could go to finer and finer grits here, but for this hammer I really don't think I need to. I've got another trick I'll use. You can also use a Scotch-Brite belt on a belt grinder. They make Scotch-Brite belts. I don't use them often, but they can come in handy for things like this. But my preferred tool for this is a fiber deburring wheel. This is sort of like Scotch-Brite, but it's hard packed wheel. It's not a loose floppy wheel, and it's not as grabby as a buffing wheel. But even so, I work down here, so if it grabs it, it throws it to the floor. Don't work up on the top part of the wheel. So we're going to go ahead and go to this wheel, and that should come nearly to a polish. The truth is that it's probably as polished as you need to go with something like this, but I'm going to take it to the buffing wheel anyways. Now I'm going to start with a coarse compound on this wheel, then I'll go to a fine compound on the other wheel. This is the one the squirrels have been chewing up. Sorry about standing right in front of the camera. There's just not a good place to put the camera next to this buffing wheel. It's kind of shoehorned into a corner. To notice, again, I work on the bottom. If the buffing wheel grabs this, you want it to go to the floor. If you work up here, it comes back in your face. Especially dangerous if you're polishing knives. here's the completed hammerhead. I was thinking about filing the little decorative file work and bringing it out to silver, but I'm just not sure it needs it, and if I do that, there's no going back. So I think I'm going to leave it that way. I like it the way it is. The faces are nicely polished. Flat face on one end, ball-peen on the other end. It's going to be a very nice little hammer. The next thing to do is going to be to put a handle on it, and people have expressed some interest in seeing me do the handle, so we're going to have to kind of wait till this afternoon again and stretch the video out, or my video time. You won't notice a difference. It'll be just almost immediately as far as the video is concerned. But I'll do some more shop stuff this morning and then go to the basement this afternoon when it heats up, and we'll cut out a handle, maybe come back up here and do some sanding, because the belt grinder is still the best way to sand a handle. Get the handle fit on this, and it will be a finished hammer. And Mr. Murphy, who bought this hammer, ordered it 3 months ago, is going to be glad to get his hammer. The head weighs 9.5 ounces. So I had originally estimated maybe 12. This is smaller than that, but it's still a good sized little hammer for what he wants it for, and he never specified a weight. He had just specified, I want one like you made for Jason over at Texas Heritage Woodworks, which somebody in the first video picked up on that. They've apparently followed Jason at Texas Heritage on Instagram or wherever else you can follow Jason, and noticed that I was wearing a Texas Heritage t-shirt in that first video while I was making the Texas Heritage inspired hammer. That was purely coincidental. I didn't even think of that when I started. I just picked a t-shirt out of the drawer that day, and that just happened to be the one. But seems appropriate. So if you are interested in some woodworking and things related to woodworking, you might go over to Instagram and check out Jason at Texas Heritage Woodworks. Of course, any adventure in handle making starts at the wood pile. I've got various pieces of Osage Orange. Some are too small, some are wide enough but way too skinny. I like Osage Orange for these, so I hope I have something usable. Oh, that piece right there looks just perfect. I might be able to get a couple of similar handles out of this. So let's go to the workbench and lay out a handle. Looks like I've got a few other things on the bench here that are waiting for handles, and I've got handles started for, but we'll worry about that later. I'll move those over here. We're going to worry about this. Now I'd like to start with something that is already pretty close to the right size for the handle, and kind of then eyeball any differences that I want for what I'm making here. And I went looking for an already made store-bought handle just to use for some ideas. What I actually found was an Osage Orange handle that is pretty much exactly what I want to duplicate, because this is a spare handle for a hammer just like this. And if I wasn't doing it for video, I would just put this handle right there on that hammer, and we would call the whole thing done. But because it's for video, we'll go ahead and cut this out. This isn't going to be thick enough to get two out of, so I'll only be able to get one out of it. I think I'll start by just ripping this down to a little bit better size, something that will be easier to work with. No reason to work with any more material than we have to. So here we have a very roughed out handle. Just gets rid of the majority of the excess material. Now it's time to do some shaping. The hammer project really likes to bring us back to this part of the shop where the grinder is. Really comes in handy for this stuff. Like I say, this will make short work of shaping this handle with almost no risk of splitting or splintering. So let's get to work on the grinder and make a handle. Again, this is someplace you really need to wear respiratory protection, hearing protection, and I run a dust collector when I do this. For steel, the bucket of water collects most of the steel dust and grindings, but for the wood dust, a dust collector really helps. But we have a handle that is just starting to fit the head, so a little bit of fine trimming on the shaving horse and we should have a finished hammer. We went ahead and left the film running for all of the grinding or sanding steps to create the handle. So you can see that that's a relatively quick process to make a handle using that kind of equipment. It can also destroy one really fast, especially with the 40 grit belt. That was a 40 grit, a 60 grit, and finished up with a 220 grit belt. And the handle just almost fits. It starts to go through. It just needs its final adjustment. Of course, George has to come down and help. He's one of the indoor cats, unlike Smitty, who gets to go up to the shop when he feels like it. So this may be a little bit of a nuisance while we're working on the handle. Our task now is to try and get the final fit up. I typically just do that with a spoke shave. Kind of pay attention to where the handle fits and where it doesn't fit, and as you get close you can start seeing some wear marks on the side of the handle, and that will tell you exactly where it's fitting up and where it is not. So that goes on, and we could get away with that, but I'd like to get it closer to this shoulder. So I know the hammer came right down to here, so I'm going to take the material below that away. Keep things symmetrical, and don't get carried away here. It's real easy to take off too much, and then the handle won't fit right. It's really going on quite nicely. It's just almost tight. There's a little gap here, so I want to keep going until that gap disappears. I might have to go to a different spoke shave. Driving the handle down like that uses the inertia of the head to pull it up good and tight, and that's the best way to seat a hammer handle. Make sure you look at it down the end, sideways, make sure it's not twisted, make sure the head's not canted one way or the other this way. Just try to adapt if you have run into some problems like that. I'm going to go ahead and trim this off here, and I'm going to make a mark down here so I know how far to put my saw kerf for the wedge. This gives me an idea of how far I'm going to want this to seat ultimately. I'm going to go to my cutest little spoke shave. It's an E. Preston & Sons, little antique spoke shave, but it has a nice small profile. It does a pretty good job of getting in here and getting down into that sloped surface here. I'm going to have to make a new blade for this one of these days because it's just about nothing left to sharpen almost. It's been well used over its life. I think we can go over to the workbench now and do a last cleanup with a scraper. Now you don't have to use my assortment of tools. You could use rasps and files and whatever you want. I've actually sat and just whittled out handles, and you can do a very nice job if you take your time. But this is a little bit more production oriented, although not as production oriented as might be nice if I were doing lots of handles. But that cleans that up nicely. And that should be all we need. I've already cut a wedge, and that doesn't go very far down in the kerf, so it'll have to wedge and have to go tight to tighten that up. Again, I want to make sure I put this on going the right direction. And sometimes if the wedge doesn't quite fit down in the eye, you can trim it a little bit. Just using a good sharp knife is all you need for that. But I think we're ready to seat this the last time. But before I put the wedge in, I want to look and make sure it looks straight. This is actually kicked off a little bit, so I do need to fix that. The other thing you can do is turn it around and see if it fits different. So pretty much I just need to trim this a little bit. And see here, this is where the good sharp knife can really come in handy. In some ways I think this is easier than the spoke shave, but not quite as controlled because it will take any size cut you let it. So you have to stay in control. And yes, this is a knife I made. I don't make many knives, but these carving knives aren't too hard to do. That is much better. So the wedge is going to go in here. It's just not quite going to start, so I'm going to trim it. Now this looks really dangerous, but if you work the knife this way, you can miss your thumb. You just have to be careful. A technique I've learned from Sloyd people. They do lots of carving, particularly spoons are a real popular Sloyd project. At one point I think Sloyd just referred to any kind of handcraft. Now it tends to be mostly woodworking and very applicable to knives and axes and adzes and things like that. That's going to start. Put just a little bit of glue on there. Just a little bit down in the kerf. Put that where the camera might see it. And then I put just a little bit more wood glue on here. I do this just to keep the wedge from later falling out. Then I set it on an anvil and drive it home. Now I have to clean up all that squeezed out glue. Now, driving a wedge that fits that tightly can split your handle if it isn't well contained by the eye of the hammer. So you got to make sure that handle fits, or you're going to have real problems as a result of driving the wedge. Just clean up a little bit of gluey fingerprints there. So I'm going to let the glue dry, then we'll come back, we'll trim that, probably let it dry till tomorrow morning, and then I'll put some oil on it. Well, we've given the glue on the wedge plenty of time to dry, so it's not going to fall out as I mess around with trimming the top off. And I'm going to trim this off and leave about 1/4 inch. Now if you're really careful, you can trim a little bevel around the top of this and kind of clean up that saw cut with a good sharp knife. You can also do some of this back on the belt sander again, or maybe a palm sander, I'm not real sure about that, or a file, something like that. The big thing though is I want to leave the head black. I like that look, and if you get too close or you're not careful, you're going to leave little shiny spots where you scrape it with the sandpaper. I don't want to do that. So I'll carefully do that. Probably tomorrow I'll take it back up to the shop and then I'll put some oil on it. But really none of that we need to show for the video. I consider this a finished project. Nice little hammer, 9.5 ounce head, probably close to 12 ounces with the handle, and it'll be ready to go out once the oil dries on the handle. So probably Thursday morning this will go out in the mail, and somebody will be glad to get this. So there's the completed little hammer, all ready to go. As always, I hope you enjoyed this little project. I hope it was entertaining. I hope it was educational, and that you got some sort of information that you can use out of this. By all means, stick around, watch a few of the other videos, share the videos with your friends, but then make time in your day to get out to your shop, make something, but stay safe, do wear your safety glasses, and we'll see you for the next one.